It's nice to see you all. My name is Caroline. I'm sometimes there, where Jill is, but today I'm going to be preaching for the first time, and I'm very excited to be speaking to you from Habakkuk. So we're in the middle of a 3-week series on Habakkuk, and it's not a name that we say very often. I feel like I've said Habakkuk more times in the past couple of weeks than in my whole life so far, but it's one of the small books towards the back of the New Testament, and he's a really interesting minor prophet, we call him. We have major prophets, which are the ones we talk about all the time. So people like Isaiah, who we talk about a lot around Christmas, and places like that. And then we have minor prophets who just wrote very short books, but they're still really worth reading. So here's a picture of Habakkuk. And as far as we know, we think he was a temple prophet. So he was living about 600 BC. He was living in the time when Israel, the Jewish people, the whole kind of civilization, was divided into 2 kingdoms. So they had Israel in the north and they had Judah in the south. And Habakkuk was in the temple in Jerusalem in Judah. So he's in the south in this divided kingdom. So last week, Jane Chaffee took us through the first chapter of Habakkuk. Conveniently, there are 3 chapters, so we're doing one a week for 3 weeks. And Jane looked at chapter 1, which is where Habakkuk cries out to God about the injustice that he can see, the violence and the conflict in his society. And what we found from what Jane took us through is that there are no easy answers in this book. And it's true of faith generally. There are no easy answers. There are no quick solutions when it comes to walking with God and choosing to follow Jesus. But it was an encouragement, really, to speak to God about the injustice that we can see. And as we go through the rest of Habakkuk, I don't want you to think that this is a book that's not easy and it's all about practicing your faith even though it's very difficult. There are some glimmers of hope. Habakkuk goes on this journey which begins in a deep pain and anger at the world, but it ends, as we'll see next week, in a peace and a joy and praising. So he's been on this really interesting spiritual journey with God, and we're in the middle of it. We're in chapter 2. So how do we get from anger and pain into a place of praising? So I'm going to ask Peter to come and read to us from chapter 2, and then we'll explore a little bit more about Habakkuk's journey.
Okay, if you have a Pew Bible, please find it. And the first one to find Habakkuk, please put your hand in the air. Habakkuk, it's towards the end of the Old Testament. And when you found it, put your hand up. Yes, well done, Joy. Okay, well, it's on page 907. In the Pew Bibles. And I'm reading from chapter 2, verse 1 to 8, and then 18 to 20. I will stand at my watchpost and station myself on the ramparts. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me, and what he will answer concerning my complaint. Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that a runner may read it. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Look at the proud. Their spirit is not right in them, but the righteous live by their faith. Moreover, wealth is treacherous and arrogant. Do not endure. They open their throats wide as Sheol, like death. They never have enough. They gather all nations for themselves and collect all peoples for their own. Shall not everyone taunt such people with mocking riddles and say about them, alas, for you heap up what is not your own. How long will you load yourselves with goods taken in pledge? Will not your own creditors suddenly rise, and those who make you tremble wake up? Then you will be booty for them. Because you have plundered many nations, all that survive of the prophets shall plunder you, because of human bloodshed and violence on the earth. to cities and to all who live in them. Now across to verse 18. What use is an idol once its maker has shaped it and cast an image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in what has been made, though the product is only an idol that cannot speak. Alas for you who say the wood, wake up, to silent stone, rouse yourself. Can it teach? See, it is plated with gold and silver, and there is no breath in it at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Peter. Now, before we delve into Habakkuk, I've got a bit of a social experiment to do, and I just need one volunteer who really likes marshmallows. Anybody up for this? I saw a hand at the back. Go on, one. But it's nothing scary, don't worry. Excellent, right. Thank you. I have here one marshmallow. Conveniently, you're up at the back. You can stay where you are, it's fine. So I have one marshmallow on a delightful plate. What's your name? Ethan. So, Ethan, here's one marshmallow. Now, the deal is, Ethan, you can keep that one marshmallow. You can have it now, or if you wait till the end of my sermon, you can have a second marshmallow. So that's the deal. One marshmallow now, or two marshmallows in an unidentified amount of time. There's no trick, and we won't judge you if you eat it now. It's genuinely your choice. One now, or two later. Now, some of you will recognise this experiment. It's a classic social experiment. It's quite an old one. And it's often done with children to test how good they are at waiting. It's about how well we can exercise our capacity for something called delayed gratification. So it's whether you can wait for the thing that you really want. So Ethan is going to exercise his capacity for delayed gratification. But to do that, he needs to be able to do two things. So firstly, he needs to be able to visualise a second marshmallow, because all I've shown him is one. So he needs to be able to think, what would a second marshmallow look like, and to understand how that would be better than just having one marshmallow. The second thing he needs to do is to trust the person who has promised him two marshmallows. Because actually, I don't think we've met before today, so he has no basis to trust me. But he needs to be able to do those two things: visualise what it is that he's waiting for and hoping for, and trust the person who has promised it to him. So as I was approaching Habakkuk, I thought of this experiment. You'll see why. And I also thought of a verse from Hebrews, which has been something that I've carried with me throughout my life. And the verse is this one. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. So I just want you to bear that in mind. We're not going to look too much at Hebrews today, but I think it's a great biblical definition of faith. And Ethan's going to exercise his faith throughout this sermon as he waits for the thing that he's not able to see. And when we think about waiting, it's often said that in this generation, in this culture, we are an impatient culture. We don't know how to wait. And I think that's changed even within a generation. So I remember when I was quite young, the Harry Potter books were coming out about the same time that I was in school. So that kind of ages me a little bit. But some of my school friends, I was really jealous of them because they went and they camped outside Waterstones and WH Smith, and they would stay all night with their parents in their tents with their toast and their porridge and whatever they had, waiting for the new Harry Potter book to come out so that they could be the first people to get hold of them. And even within a generation, we don't see that happening anymore. I'm sure some of you remember the headlines of, queues and queues of children waiting for these new books. It doesn't happen now because we can pre-order the thing that we want online, or we can just download it onto our computers or onto our tablets or on our phones. I think we are forgetting, in a sense, how to wait. But waiting is hard, especially when it's something you really care about, something you really want. Our sense of time gets distorted as we're waiting. Think of the moment of waiting for an answer to an important question. In reality, it might only be the fraction of a second, but it can feel like a lifetime. I'm sure you've all been in that moment where you've asked a question like, do you fancy going for a drink sometime? Or, did you get the job? Or, will you marry me? Or even at the hospital, what did the results say? Or did he make it through the operation? The answer might actually come quickly in real time, but because it is so important to us, it's an answer that can change the course of our lives. It feels like forever just in that moment that we're waiting. And Habakkuk is in that moment when we meet him in chapter 2. He's waiting for the answer to this question. He's cried out to God, how long do we have to live with injustice and violence and unfairness in this world? How long? And he's standing now, as he says at the start of chapter 2, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. He's like looking out over the whole city, just seeing, is God anywhere in here? Can I find an answer anywhere? He's in that agony of waiting, and he hasn't just asked this question for himself. It is his personal emotion that we're reading about, but the question he's asking is for the whole community. He's living in a divided civilization. They've actually split into two kingdoms. I think we can identify a little bit with that kind of schism in our own society. There's a corrupt king on the throne who has caused political unrest and bloodshed across the country. And Habakkuk in chapter 1 describes violence, injustice, destruction, conflict, and corruption. There's a lot going on, so he's calling out not just for himself, but for the whole community. The whole community is waiting. And throughout the Old Testament, we read the story of a people who are waiting. The Israelites are waiting through the whole Old Testament for the Messiah, the anointed one, somebody that God has promised will come and make all things right with God. And not long after Habakkuk, about 200 years later, not that long in the grand scheme of things, the Israelites, the Jewish people, would experience something that's known as the Great Silence. And it's visible in your Bible as the gap between the end of the Old Testament and the start of the New Testament. There was a gap of around 400 years where it seems that God said nothing. There were no prophecies, there were no miracles, at least not that anybody bothered to write down. There was this great silence, a great waiting for the whole community. And as we sit here today, some of us are in that time of a great silence. Some of us are feeling that we are in this eternal waiting for God to answer, for God to act, for God to move. So as I said, if we go back to Ethan, who's still got his marshmallow at the back. Excellent. Ethan's waiting very patiently. And he has to trust the person who has promised what is coming to him. So, Ethan, you're all the way at the back, but if you could just give me a yes or a no. Do you trust me to give you a second marshmallow? Excellent. Good lad. Now, as I said before, we actually haven't met before today, so there's no basis for that trust. I could be a very untrustworthy person, and Ethan wouldn't know this. If I'd done the experiment with my husband, he might have had a little bit more background into my character and my trustworthiness. So to have trust, to be able to trust somebody's promise, we need a relationship with them. And God is reminding Habakkuk later in chapter 2 of the relationship that they have. At the end of chapter 2, God says, I'm not a worthless idol. I'm not made of wood. I'm not made of stone. I'm the living God. Remember who I am. We have this relationship. You know me and I know you. God is reminding Habakkuk, trust me, we know each other. And later in chapter 3, as we'll see next week, Habakkuk recalls these moments in the Jewish history where God does step in, he does change something. He talks about the parting of the Red Sea, the rescue from Egypt. He talks about the moment when the walls fall and the sun stands still. All these great stories that we read about further in the Old Testament. Habakkuk is going to recall these moments from his community history, which are the basis of his relationship with God. He knows he can trust God to do what he has promised. And he can do that in a sense because it's written down for him. He didn't live through the passing of the Red Sea, but he's got a record of it. He can read those things. And writing these things down helps us, it encourages us in our faith. And it's why God says to Habakkuk in verse 2, write down the revelation, write down what I'm about to say. Grab a pen and paper, it's going to be important. You're going to want a record of this. Write it down. I didn't bring them with me today because there are so many of them, but at home I've got about 10 notebooks which are full to the brim of my records with God. So I became a Christian when I was 14, and since that time I've been writing down everything that God has said to me through the Bible, through prophetic words, through other people, and everything that I've been praying about, every time that God has answered a prayer, every time he's changed a situation. I've got 10 notebooks, and they are full. I'm just on to my 11th. And any time I need an encouragement, of course I've got the Bible, but any time that I need to remember what God has done in my own life, I go back to those 10 notebooks, I open one at random, and I can read, yes, you were there. You heard that prayer, you changed it. That one took 6 years, but you moved. You did something about that situation. This one only took a couple of days. But you heard these prayers, you spoke those promises, you are trustworthy. So if you do nothing else after church, could I encourage you to just go past Smith's or Sainsbury's and pick up a notebook and start your own record with God? Write these things down, write down the revelation so that you can come back to it and be encouraged. And the other reason that we write things down, the reason that the Bible is written down for us, is because writing these things down encourages the whole community of believers. Habakkuk's job is a temple prophet. His job is to listen to God on behalf of the community and tell them all what he says. So God doesn't just say, write this down, but he says, make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. Write it down in your best handwriting. Write it large. Put it on a billboard so that everybody can read these words of encouragement, these words of promise. We're doing that a little bit in our own church. At the 7 p.m. service, there's always a slot where we can encourage each other and tell each other as a group what God has been doing. In the prayer chapel, it's just gone down recently, but we had a really great space for people to write down what they felt God was saying to the church. And I wonder if at some point we might see some of the fruit of those. But there's been a few weeks where we've been writing down encouragement for the whole church. So if God says something to you, it might not just be for you, it might be for the encouragement of the whole church, the whole community of believers. So we're going to go back to Ethan. Still got his marshmallow? Excellent. So Ethan is doing, as we said, he is trusting the person who made the promise. He's exercising his trust in me. He's also exercising his faith, as we've still got up on the screen. He is being sure of what he hopes for and certain of what he does not see. I've not shown any of you that there are more marshmallows today. I might have genuinely just brought a single marshmallow to church for the purpose of this illustration. None of you know that. You all have faith that at the end of this sermon there will be a second marshmallow. And you can visualize what the marshmallow looks like, if nothing else because I've put a great big photo of them up on the screen. So you need to have faith that this other marshmallow exists. And similarly, we need to have faith that there is more than what we can see here and now. And God is helping Habakkuk to visualize what he's promised. There's a whole section of chapter 2 that we didn't read out because Peter would get sore legs from standing here for the whole day. And it's a section where God addresses Habakkuk's cry, his cry about injustice. You can read it later. And God says, "Woe to you, woe to you, woe to you." And he's talking about the Babylonians who are about to come and oppress the Israelite people. It's a strange journey that happens throughout the book where Habakkuk says, "Why is there injustice?" And God says, "There's about to be more injustice. But in the end, I'm going to make it right, because woe to you, Babylonians, I can see what you're doing." And the way that he does this is so interesting because he identifies specific things, specific injustices, and he names the punishment for them. And one of the verses we heard was in verse 8. He says, "Because you have plundered many peoples, the peoples that are left will plunder you. You have done this, this will happen to you." It's an Old Testament idea of divine retribution, the eye for the eye, tooth for a tooth. But in doing that, God is helping Habakkuk to visualize what justice will look like. Habakkuk has said, "I just want things to be better." And God says, "I know, I can see what's wrong, and I have an exact plan of how I will make it right. Here's a sneak preview of what I'm going to do." And do you know, God does that for us in the New Testament as well. We have an entire book at the end of the Bible, Revelation. We sang a song that's based on that book, Revelation song, just now. And Revelation gives us a picture of the end of all things, the time when Jesus returns, as he promised. When there will be no more pain, no more mourning, there will be a new heaven and a new earth. It's the second marshmallow that we cannot see, but God is describing it for us. We have to trust that it exists. Otherwise, there's just one marshmallow. And quite soon we're going to come together and take communion, which is a moment when we can come together and both look back at God's faithfulness and look forward towards the thing he's promised us. As we eat the bread and drink the wine, we remember that God kept his promise. He promised in the Old Testament that he would send a Messiah, an anointed one, somebody who would be the end to all the rituals of sacrifice and the retribution, the eye for the eye, tooth for the tooth, somebody who would change that system and say everything is made right with God. Through Jesus, everything has been made right with God. We still live in a world of injustice, but we can have direct access to God through Jesus. God kept his promise. And as we walk down this aisle to the communion table, in a way we're physically stating our belief in Jesus' promise that he will come again. There will be a second time when he comes to make everything right once and for all. So we're going to look backwards and we're going to look forwards, remembering what God has promised. So, if you take nothing else from this sermon, we live in a one marshmallow world. But there is a second marshmallow. And Ethan, you've waited so well, I'm going to give you the second marshmallow. You can get an extra plate as well. Enjoy those. There is more. There are 2 marshmallows. We just see one of them now. And I think, not to give away too much of next week's sermon, but I think that's a realization that Habakkuk comes to by the end of this chapter. There is so much more that we can't see. We just have to have faith that it is there. So at the end of this chapter, the final thing at the end of this chapter that God says to Habakkuk, as he reminds him that he is the living God, he says, "The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him." So as we prepare ourselves to come and take communion, let's just keep silence for a moment. And let's consider where we are on this journey that Habakkuk has been through. We might be crying out in the silence to God. "How long, O Lord? When will you change this situation? When will you speak?" We might be in a time of waiting. We might be holding on to that picture of what we hope for. You might even be in chapter 3. You might be full of joy and praise, encouraged by God's promises and the things he's done in your own life. And as we bring those things to God, there might be things that you'd like to pray about with other people after the service. And we have a really great prayer team who will just be in the side chapel just next to the band at the end of the service.